Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today for today's webinar. My name is Marwa Gaumrawi, and I serve as the Director of Operations at the WCYS and will be your moderator today. Today's webinar is hosted by the Washington Center for Yemeni Studies, whose vision is to be one of the main sources and references for researchers and those interested in Yemeni affairs. To provide wider support for the democratic process, the Center is committed to produce highly professional and impartial studies and reports and share them with specialists in Yemeni affairs in various aspects, political, humanitarian, and cultural. Today's webinar will discuss the current diplomacy trends and shifts in the US administration toward the Yemeni conflict. I would like to welcome our speakers, Dr. Nabeel Khoury, Ms. Hannah Porter, and Mr. Bara Shaiba. Thank you for taking the time and being here with us today. Just a little housekeeping before we get started. Today's session will be entirely in English. However, we will email all participants a report summarizing the webinar in both languages, Arabic and English. Please note the webinar's report will also be available on the website, wcysus.org. If you have any questions during the presentation, please type them into the chat or the Q&A section or in the comment section on Facebook, and we will have them answered during our Q&A session. Now, without further ado, we will welcome our first speaker, Dr. Nabeel Khoury. Dr. Nabeel Khoury, between academia and the US Department, he has devoted his working life to examining the US role in the Middle East and to following the cultural and political developments taking place across the Middle East and North Africa. Dr. Nabeel Khoury is a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Rafik al-Hariri Center for the Middle East. His commentaries appear on the Atlantic Council's MENASource blog, the Cairo Review of Global Affairs, and his own blog, Middle East Corner. Welcome, Dr. Khoury. Thank you for being here with us today.
Thank you, and hello from Hammana, Lebanon, my hideout when I come to spend the summer in Lebanon. And this summer, things are very depressing in the country as a whole, with long lines waiting for gas for people's cars, and they don't know what price from day to day to pay. There are shortages, including of basic services such as electricity, all things that you're quite familiar with. And I think the suffering of the people of Lebanon and the people of Yemen are becoming very similar by the day. And things are rather explosive politically here as well. So all that to say that if we lose power in the middle of this, please understand that the internet is very intermittent here. So far, so good, however. Let me start by saying that I was very optimistic when President Biden took office and when he appointed a special envoy for the Yemen conflict. And Tim Linderking has been doing an excellent job in terms of staying in touch with all the relevant parties, also relying on the mediation of Oman. However, I think now that this Biden initiative towards Yemen is past the 7-month mark, I think it's beginning to lose steam. And in my last article and in my last conversation with Tim, I tried to warn that you really need to accomplish something on the ground. Otherwise, people start losing interest, and in particular, the warring parties, as well as potential and active mediators in the region, like Oman, like Qatar, etc. What is happening now is there are some specific the negotiation that's going on. From the US view, the goal is to stop the war in Marib because it is the most active front in the war. and because it has dangerous implications should it continue and lead to the success or takeover by either side, really, of Ma'rib, of the Ma'rib conflict. And once you get a ceasefire in Ma'rib, the idea is to move on to negotiate a general ceasefire and then move on to transitional issues. The problem, the specific hurdle is timing. The Houthis would like the lifting of the siege, in particular over Sana'a and Hodeidah, to come first as a humanitarian gesture. And that actual ceasefire should be negotiated purely on political grounds. For Saudi Arabia in particular, and I don't say the Arab coalition because Saudi is really leading here as the main protagonist. For Saudi Arabia, they would like to negotiate the lifting of the siege for a ceasefire, specifically in Ma'rib. So on that, neither side has budged in recent months. And in addition, the Houthis have put forth what they're referring to these days as the Oman initiative. When the Omanis went with the Houthis to Sana'a, they came back with a suggestion from the Houthis that what they want is access to oil and gas, obviously, in Ma'rib. They said, well, we can stop the war if you give us civilian Ma'rib city and access via a committee, a national committee, to the resources in Ma'rib. That's something new, and that has been a non-starter for Saudi Arabia, for the Hadi government, as well as for Tim Linderking, who is not too pleased with this latest Houthi initiative. There is some logic to trying to give each side what they really need instead of what they demand specifically. But that strategy would end up giving the Houthis access to oil and gas in Ma'rib. It would also provide a security guarantee to the southern border of Saudi Arabia. That, however, has not proved by the main protagonists either. So what we have also is what I sense a kind of, let's use the vernacular, a wimping out by the Biden administration. They came in with some tough talk towards Saudi Arabia, as well as towards the UAE. And they have backed off from that. Discussions from inside the administration. I think primarily there are probably several factors involved. But given the changing regional and international balance of power, the US is beginning to feel vulnerable, some of it due to steps by the administration. But given that the entry of China for the first time is beginning to be interested politically and not just commercially in the region, given the rising influence of Russia, and frankly, given the successes of the Houthis on the ground, the continued successes, and the continued failure of Saudi intervention and the failure of the Hadi government to lead, to unite the pro-Hadi forces. All of these things are causing the Biden administration to hesitate, not to take the tough line that they originally wanted to take towards Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And this is causing a lack of clarity, and I think is causing the Saudis to consider options, and to some extent is emboldening the Houthis. So I leave it at that. I think we are at a rather bad point, at a rather dangerous stage in the conflict. And I don't think we're doing very well in terms of peace negotiations right now.
Dr. Nabeel, to just follow up on what you've said, what do you think the US diplomatic efforts can realistically achieve on the ground at this point or moving forward?
Well, I mean, there are really two options. I mean, one option is to continue to press ahead and try to convince both sides that they can have what they really need: security for Saudi Arabia and access to resources for the Houthis, and also some kind of a promise. You need to keep dangling the image of the end game that you're working towards. What would Yemen look like if peace were to break out? And what would each side get ultimately? You need to focus on that to incentivize both parties to accept. Failing that, I think there is a sense, frankly, of trying to get Saudi Arabia and the UAE to accept a certain kind of reality on the ground in Yemen, which may not be palatable. The fact is Saudi Arabia has lost 12 years of war on the side of Saleh fighting the Houthis during the 6-year war, including direct intervention by their air force in the last year of that war. And they failed to subdue the Houthis then. And now we have 6 going on 7 years of their support, very active support of the Hadi government. And again, they are failing to subdue the Houthis. So at some point, I mean, the US, after 20 years of failing to subdue the Taliban in Afghanistan, is pulling out. I mean, at some point, you know, whether palatable or not, you have to say, how long can I keep going? And with all the devastation that this war has caused inside Yemen, you say, okay, I don't like the Houthis, we have to give them what they want here, provided they're very clear about what it is that they really want in the end. But there is a kind of reality that has to set in. This war cannot keep going on forever, and it keeps getting more and more dangerous in a regional way.
Thank you, Dr. Khoury, for that. And now we'll go ahead and turn it over to Hannah Porter. Hannah is an analyst at the international development firm DT Global, where she focuses on Yemeni media and local conflict dynamics. She holds a master's degree from the University of Chicago, where she wrote her thesis on Houthi rhetoric and propaganda. Hello, Hannah. Thank you for joining us today.
Hi, Marwa. Thank you so much. And thank you for the Washington Center for Yemeni Studies for hosting this important panel. It's absolutely a pleasure to be on a panel alongside Dr. Khoury and Mr. Shayban. So thank you very much. So I'm hoping that my brief summary today will maybe outline how the US administration, how the Biden administration is approaching Yemen's war, Yemen's conflict, and maybe we'll explain some of the decisions that they've made and some of the decisions that Dr. Khoury just outlined. So of course, we've seen recently, basically since January, since he came into office, a number of analyses and discussions about Biden's new approach to Yemen and how this would differ from the Trump administration's dealing with the conflict. I would describe it in short as being a mixed approach of prioritizing diplomacy and pulling back from the military approach. But as we've seen in the last few months, this is a very complicated process and not necessarily an effective one, but I would argue the best possible option for the US at this point for a few reasons. So just to go through some of the decisions that the Biden administration has made, in early February, of course, he ended the support for the offensive operations, including weapon sales to Saudi Arabia. this is a decision that's in fact more complicated than it seems, because offensive operations is a little bit ambiguous in terms of what that actually includes. And they clarified later that there would also be counterterrorism operations within Yemen. So it's not correct to say that the US has completely disconnected itself militarily from Yemen, but simply pulled back from its support from the Saudi coalition. At the same time, there was the appointment of Linderking. He's obviously a very experienced diplomat with deep knowledge of Yemen, and he appears to be very well respected by many parties to the conflict and analysts who are expert in Yemen. So then later in mid-February, the Biden administration rescinded the terrorist designation of the Houthis, which obviously the Trump administration at 0 hour in their final days had put in place. Many have criticized this turning back or lifting of the terrorist designation, especially saying that the US government could have demanded concessions in return in order to lift that designation. I disagree with this. I think that the unconditional reversal of this designation was absolutely the right decision, and I hope to explain why. So first of all, the Houthis were not really that impacted by the terrorist designation. They actually wore it as a badge of honor. And you can see that as from a lot of public statements from figures like Hussein al-Azin, Mohammed Abdeslam, and Mohammed Ali al-Houthi. They really did not care that much. In fact, it just proved their point more generally about the US's hostile approach to them. At the same time, this designation was having a terrible impact on the people on the ground in Yemen, regular civilians, because it became much more difficult for humanitarian aid and development programs to reach Houthi-held territory. If the US administration had imposed a kind of condition saying we will lift these terrorist designations if in return, for example, you pull back from Madib or you release prisoners, whatever the concession might be, I'm quite confident that the Houthis would have just doubled down and refused to meet those demands because they would have prided themselves on not bending to American will. So then you simply would have had the US administration in another kind of red line scenario where they had set rules that then they were forced to abide by, which meant keeping the terrorist designation in place. And ultimately that would have just impacted Yemeni civilians. So there was a lot of discussion around that decision. Ultimately, I think it was the right one by the Biden administration. So they replaced that blanket terrorist designation of the Houthis with some targeted sanctions for individuals, which I would argue is more effective and also less damaging towards for Yemeni civilians. So the following month in March, USAID, of course, lifted the suspension of humanitarian assistance to northern Yemen, which I think was also another positive step. The previous year, I think around $50 million was suspended, and obviously that has impact on what aid can reach people in need. So then we are seeing all these moves that indicate an attempt at diplomacy, an attempt at kind of not being as harsh towards the Houthis as maybe the Trump administration or the Obama administration was. But then in June, we start to see that Linderking is criticizing the Houthis more openly. He's saying that they bear major responsibility for their refusal to participate or engage meaningfully in a ceasefire or negotiations. And also the US government seized a number of Houthi and Iranian affiliated websites as an attempt. I don't really know exactly what they were trying to accomplish, to be completely honest, because the Houthis were immediately able to just establish Al Masira or these other outlets under different domain names. But it was a way of kind of showing their power or showing that they could maybe hurt the Houthis even in a small way. So I would say that all of these actions kind of highlight two main points about the Biden administration's approach to Yemen and some understandings that I think that they've reached since January. One is that they realize now that the United States does not have the power to end the conflict in Yemen. At best, they can support initiatives to do so, whether those are local-led initiatives or maybe the Omani mediation. But whether we're using military force or diplomacy, the US cannot do it on its own. And the second, I think, is that the United States and others are beginning to realize that they have very limited tools to influence the Houthis, to pressure them, to incentivize them. This has been the case for a while. I really can't even count the number of commentaries that I've read that have said, we need to pressure the Houthis to do X, Y, or Z. But no one really explains how. How are we going to pressure them? And that's a very difficult question to answer. I mean, we've had 6.5 years of war that has only made them stronger. These sanctions, it remains to be seen if that will be effective at all. in terms of maybe incentivizing certain actions, I don't know if that has been explored, but I haven't heard many people propose that. So I would say overall that the Biden administration is rightfully prioritizing diplomacy over a military solution, and they're putting faith in the UN-led and Oman-mediated peace process. But all of these actions and decisions so far, I don't think you could describe as successes. That would be very premature because they haven't ended the conflict. They haven't had any tangible results on the ground, except for maybe averting worse humanitarian disasters. But despite these positive steps, or steps that I consider to be positive, it doesn't solve the fundamental problem that the US and other actors don't really know how to deal with the Houthis. And they have not yet accepted the reality that the Houthis are probably going to play a much bigger role in Yemen's future than anyone is comfortable with. So what we're seeing now is that the Houthis are trying to maximize their gains, whether those are political gains or territorial or financial, and they're refusing any peace deal that doesn't include the immediate lifting of the blockade and end of Saudi airstrikes. So in a way, obviously this is very frustrating to observe, and it's hard to know how to deal with this, but I think if you look at it through a practical lens, you can understand why the Houthis are taking this position, because they are coming from a position of power and they don't feel the immediate need to sit down at the negotiation table. I would finally just say that anyone that's arguing for continued military operations in Yemen, that they're needed to pressure or defeat the Houthis, has to be able to explain how these military operations would differ from the past 6.5 years. I feel like, especially in the case of Ma'rib, there's more and more arguments being made that the Saudi-led coalition needs to be more militarily active. They need to push back against the Houthis. And I appreciate that point of view, but you have to be able to explain why new military efforts would succeed when 6.5 years of them have failed and possibly only made the Houthis stronger. So finally, a hypothetical deal between the Saudis and the Houthis to end cross-border attacks or to end airstrikes or lift the blockade would almost certainly not lead to peace on the ground. We also have to consider the numerous other actors that exist in Yemen, from Islah to obviously the STC and other southern groups, some elements of the GPC and Hadi loyalists. So even if the Saudi-Houthi war ended, we still have many, many problems to deal with. And even when that peace is reached, we have to think about the reconstruction of Yemen and the post-conflict peace process, which is just a completely other, it's a different conflict or issue to deal with altogether. And I'm not really sure what the Biden administration's plan is on that. And I'll just end my comments there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hannah. And now I would like to welcome Mr. Bara Shayban. Bara Shayban is a political consultant and analyst on Yemeni affairs. He is the Middle East and North Africa caseworker with the London-based human rights group Reprieve. Before his arrival to London, he worked as Reprieve's Yemen project coordinator, investigating the US drone program and covert operations across the country. In 2013 and 2014, he served as a member of the Yemeni National Dialogue as part of the Transitional Justice Working Group. Barat joined the Yemeni uprising in 2011 against former President Ali Abdullah Saleh, where he helped to set up a media center in Sanaa's Change Square. Hello, Mr. Shayban, and welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much to you, Marwa. Thanks to the Washington Center. This is my first participation with the center, and I hope it would be one of many to come. I would like to start by the point when my arrival to the United Kingdom, and it's been more than 5 years now since my arrival, and I got to witness basically both sides of the same conflict. One side of the conflict, which is what was happening on the ground and what the Yemeni people are discussing on a daily basis. And I'm glad that I'm joined in this discussion with Dr. Nabeel Khoury, who has served as a diplomat in Yemen as the head of mission to Sana'a. And I'm also glad that I finally get to meet Hannah Porter, who I usually engage on Twitter, but I haven't actually met her in person. The discussions are around almost the same topics and around the same discussions, and sometimes people could get very fatigued and very tired. And I think that is what's happening with the international community. Finally, they're getting fatigued, tired, and exhausted by the conflict, and they want an easy way out. And this is unfortunately not a helpful approach when you're trying to resolve a conflict. Yes, you can turn the other side. That's an option for the international community and for the US administration in specific. But it's not a solution that would help to end the conflict. So the US can make a decision and say this conflict does not concern us anymore. This is an issue for the Yemenis and the Saudis or the regional maybe powers to resolve, but this is not a conflict I would be involved in. Or it can decide that it wants to have a meaningful approach that would actually end the conflict. And you cannot come from the approach that I'm exhausted and I just want to leave altogether. The main I would say disparity or gap that I see between the discussion happening between Yemenis on the ground and foreign diplomats, researchers, analysts in the US or in the UK is simply the Yemeni public are tired of having extra militants, militias, unarmed groups occupying their daily space, governing new territories on a daily basis. From 2014 onwards, there was a final attempt by the former UN envoy Jamal bin Omar in 2014 to save whatever was left of the Yemeni structure or the Yemeni state, but that collapsed immediately after the Houthis took over Sana'a, placed Hadi and the cabinet under house arrest, and effectively ending the transitional period. And then we entered the new period of I would say it's a unknown future for the country, that people don't know actually where are we heading to and when is this going to end. And the other side of the discussion is the non-Yemenis who are obsessed, I would say, with Saudi Arabia, that nothing else matters. Not what's going to happen to Yemen after the conflict is over, not going to happen what is happening to the Yemeni state, what's going to happen to the governing bodies, what's going to happen to human rights, women's rights, and the rights of the Yemeni public in general. That seems to be less of concern to the wider, I would say, international observers working on Yemen, or at least following Yemen. And the current situation comes after a couple of attempts to try to start a process that the US cannot actually influence its end game. This started, I would argue, I wasn't actually very surprised that the Biden administration would reach this almost dead end, because it started with the main deluded myth that this is a war started by a US involvement supporting Saudi-led coalition, not because this is a war that was started because of the collapse of the Yemeni state. And in any country, you need to revive the state. If you do not have the state, the militias are going to occupy. And this is what we're seeing in Sana'a, where they occupy daily spaces and even private spaces of individuals, including abducting people from their homes, abducting journalists, abducting human rights activists, shutting down of places of business, of worship, but now even abducting women, influencers, women who post on Instagram. All of this occupying and intervening in daily matters happens simply because the bare minimum of what the Yemeni experienced was the state is absent. And this is not the case just in Sana'a, to be clear, but it's also happening in Aden, where a new set of militia is filling up the space of the state, and trying to I would say, occupy daily matters that it is unable to properly address or occupy. And what is basically left? You have a group of civil society activists who come out to the streets in mass numbers in 2011, feeling let down by the international community because that was supposed to be your normal ally in the hopes and achieves of the younger generation who wanted a civil and modern future for Yemen, a civil and modern state, and interventions that are basically leading to militias occupying the role of the Yemeni state. In the attempt to try to stop the conflict, the Saudi Arabia, I would argue, started a series of concessions, starting from the Stockholm Agreement, which was disastrous in its results because it meant effectively that the international community was sealing the deal for the Houthis. So what the Houthis couldn't achieve by war, the international community was saying, let's just give them what they want in hope that this will incentivize them to actually come forward to the table. And what happened was quite the opposite. It actually enabled them to empower, regroup, and direct their attacks elsewhere in the country. And that's when I say an exhausted intervention will lead to a disastrous results. And this happened again with the Biden administration approach because it wanted to just leave as quick as possible. What happened? The Houthis took that as a clear indication that the Saudis will be leaving, so they intensified their attack on Marib. Now, on the final point, what I would like to say is, obviously, at some point, all parties will have to sit down on the table and agree to concessions. What I would argue, this is not the time. The Houthis are not ready, and they will only be ready when there is enough military power, exactly like what happened in 2015. If the Houthis were just acts to come to the table in 2015, they would have not left Aden. They would only left Aden, Taiz, Marib, and other provinces because there was enough military power, just enough to push them back. But this enough military power is not present today. And if you don't have that, the Houthis are not going to come to the table. You need to have some pressure that can push back to the political track, so a process can start. And the United States can choose to actually help what Dr. Nabeel Khoury described as the people who are supposed to be on the Hadi government to come together and actually form a united governing body that would strengthen their capacity in facing the Houthis, or it can decide to leave. But if it decides to leave, it cannot ask at the same time from the Yemenis just to give concessions, give empty concessions, like the suggestion to give them all reserves, just to give them access to the oil fields, just because they're launching violence. So rewarding them for their violence, it doesn't make sense. When you reward them for their violence, they're going to ask for more. They're going to feel that this is the way to get more. And again, I would say you need an approach that would empower the governing body. And when I say the governing body, forget the names of the legitimacy and who's legitimate. Is it President Hadi or the other side? You need the state structure to renew its capability on the ground. In Aden, in Hadramaut, in Taiz, in Marib, in all of the places that you actually can start a functioning. So the civil and modern way of life can at least slowly start trickling back into society. That's only when you're going to have the civil society can come back to the scene. That's when you're going to have the media come back to the scene. And that's when the people who we all saw in 2011 can have an influence on the picture. If that's not happening, if that state structure, the bare minimum, the safety net of the people is not there, of course, everything will collapse. And it will be an endless cycle of violence that I'm afraid will not end anytime soon.
So, Mr. Shaiban, recently the Pentagon has stated that they will provide military support to Yemen. Do you think that's part of a new strategy that, you know, will kind of fall through with what you just mentioned? And what would that look like? Is it going to be physical presence on the ground, or is it going to be monetary, or is it going to be training? And will that actually kind of push for a shift in what's going on?
Well, I'm not sure that the announcement made by the Pentagon is in that direction, because it's very limited and very focused on smuggling and counterterrorism, propping up counterterrorism operations. But it's very limited to say that actually this is the thing that can prop up the Yemeni government. What is actually needed, desperately needed, we cannot rely in Yemen on humanitarian aid forever. And again, I say this, I witnessed both sides of the argument. I've been on channels from BBC to Al Jazeera to all of the British channels and newspapers you can think of. And the discussion is only how can we send more humanitarian aid? The Yemeni people cannot live on humanitarian aid. You need to think of how can we revive the state structure that can provide the safety net for the people. Only then that what we consider is some going back to normality at a minimum level can come back, and you can start that at places that you can actually influence and have an impact. You can do that in Aden, you can do that in Marib, you can do that in Hadramaut, and that would maybe encourage groups inside Sana'a and inside Hajjah, my hometown, and in Sada, to actually see that there is an end game. There is a final solution that can look a little bit more promising than what they are experiencing and witnessing right now in Yemen.
Thank you. We're currently going to open the floor for questions, and I do have, so please, if you have a question, feel free to send it in the chat or in the comments section on Facebook. My first question is to Hannah. If you know, based on what you said, and if there's an agreement that is reached between the Houthis and Saudi Arabia, and you know, international attention waning off of Yemen, what is that going to look like on the ground? What do the Yemenis want, and how can the U.S. actually influence and help those, you know, as you said, local initiatives rise up and, you know, take back what's theirs?
Thanks, Marwa. So I agree with Mr. Shaiban's point about the engagement of civil society and local actors. And I do think that that's key, even at this stage. Even if we're far away from a peace deal, it's important to build the capacity of those organizations now so that they are able to help reconstruct or do peace building as soon as possible and whenever necessary. I'm skeptical that the United States will be able to engage directly in that process. I think that they can provide financial support, or they can provide some kind of guidance, and of course, help with any Omani-led or UN-led initiatives. But I doubt that the US is going to be the key player in a post-conflict sphere, but certainly would be able to provide support. And I think it is absolutely critical that even after, presuming that a deal is in fact reached between the Saudis and the Houthis, that it's absolutely critical to maintain the international community's attention on that, because I feel like it just comes in waves, the kind of attention that Yemen gets. And so when there's an announcement that, oh, the United States is no longer participating in the war in Yemen, then a lot of people tune out because they think that the problem is solved. So we have to just find a way to not make people so exhausted of the topic, to keep them paying attention so that it's really resolved beyond just the Houthi-Saudi front.
Thank you very much. Dr. Khoury, I have a question here for you. Has the American approach to the war in Yemen turned into a bargaining chip for Tehran over its nuclear file?
The short answer is no. I don't think that the Yemen file is playing a big role in talks with Iran right now. These talks have stumbled partly because there's a new president in Iran, and partly because the the conditions, the requests of both sides are unacceptable to each other right now. At best, if things work out well with Iran, then the US can ask Iran to help, to influence the Houthis in ways has not been able to. Let me just say that I think in terms of the region, it is not, I mean, it's true that Iran has benefited from this war. And it now has a very strong horse in the horse race, let's call it that, in Yemen. But at the same time, you have to look at what Saudi Arabia and the UAE have gained and what they might possibly want other than what they stated at the beginning of the war, which is to restore the legitimacy of President Hadi. I just don't think it makes sense to think that they've been sincere in that effort, because for all what they've done in Yemen, they're not to restore Hadi's legitimacy. They haven't even managed to restore him physically to Aden. So you have to consider that what the Saudi presence in Al-Mahra, and in fact, we were talking about forces, you asked about the Pentagon. In fact, it's a British special force that has landed in Yemen and in the Al-Mahra region specifically, and was received by Saudi officers. So what is that all about? And from all what's going on in Yemen, why is the Saudi military presence in Al-Mahra? Also for the UAE, the fact that they are still on Socotra Island and on Mayoun Island at the entrance of Bab el-Mandeb also raises questions about their long-term interests in Yemen, and the fact that they are benefiting in a very way from that war. So why need to worry about what Iran is making of this as a regional power? You also have to worry about what Saudi Arabia and the UAE are harboring in terms of their own designs. I have to agree with my friend Bara on the idea of state building or rebuilding, because it's true that US government has not thought very theoretically, very intellectually about the fact that you've had a state collapse in Yemen. And how do you, it's not just a question of getting a ceasefire and getting peace talks, but how do you rebuild the state in Yemen using all the resources, human and other, in the country? That is a very important point, and thinking and writing on that is called for, I think.
Thank you, Dr. Khoury. Just to kind of follow up on what you just said, do you think there's a chance for Saudi Arabia to eventually leave Yemen? And if that does happen and the Houthi gets what they want, you know, you said earlier, you know, are we rewarding those, you know, militants who used force to gain the power and the wealth they have now? And if that happens, will there be a chance for the Yemeni people to actually, you know, kind of take back their legitimacy as a country and a government?
Well, I mean, I don't think it's so much rewarding as recognizing the facts on the ground. After 12 years of war in Yemen, and I do think it's important to consider the first 6 years of that war. It was only briefly interrupted. You have to consider the war has reached a kind of a stalemate, and whatever was achieved by force by the Arab coalition was achieved in the first 6 months to a year. After that, there has been no significant advance by either side. And right now, there is a stalemate with the slight possibility over time of Houthi takeover of Ma'rib. I think they can probably do it, but it would take them several more months, and it would cost them a huge toll in human cost. But if they are really determined, they can possibly do it. So at some point, you have to consider the cost of fighting that back. If on the Yemeni side, I mean, I agree, would stop or at least would limit the ambitions of the Houthis, but very poor to zero leadership. And there has been no other national leader, national figure that emerged to really give the motive to unite the other parties, the tribes. The conflict with the STC in Aden points to a very weak national front against the Houthis. So it's not a question of rewarding them, but at some point recognizing they are where they are, and it's going to be, it could take another 10 years if you focus only on militarily limiting their advance. I think much more likely to consider them as a legitimate partner in rebuilding the state of Yemen. Watching them as Yemenis, I would say that could be very successful here. But Yemeni figures, both political, military, and NGO and civil society, and I agree with Bara again, very important role for civil society. But those are the people that need to work with the Houthis towards ending the conflict and saying, let's rebuild the state of Yemen together. And then the international community can come and help.
Thank you very much, Dr. Khoury. A question for Mr. Shayban. How can the Yemeni people right now deal with the catastrophe that is going on in the country? While all of these parties are, trying to see where they fall in the equation, and if the Saudis are going to leave, if the Houthis are going to take Ma'rib, what are the tools that the Yemeni people have right now to decrease from the catastrophe that they are going through? And how can they be empowered to be an essential element in the comprehensive peace process?
The main thing is what I would focus on is many Yemenis are reaching to the conclusion that they're giving up hope with the international community. And I don't want to just tone here on a negative tone, but I would like to say it is important first and foremost for the Yemeni people to understand that no one will come to their rescue. It is primarily the duty of Yemenis, Yemeni groups, political parties, social groups, tribal figures to come together and determine a solution. That's the duty of the Yemenis before it is the duty of the United States or the UN envoy or even any regional power. The second thing, which I would focus on, and I thank Dr. Nabeel Khoury for mentioning it, is there is a reason why even after appointing a new government and forming a new government that is supposed to be more united than it used to be, that it's still struggling to operate from Aden. And that's because, again, what I mentioned at the beginning, the increased creation of militias, militants that occupy spaces that they're not supposed to govern. And in the case of Aden specifically, the ongoing funding by specifically the United Arab Emirates to the STC, which resulted into rounds of conflict inside Aden, prevented even the basic state governing bodies from operating, led to the incapability of the Yemeni government from working. So even if you replace Hadi with a new government, you will need at some point and this is where I think the United States can be helpful, because it has strong ties with the United Arab Emirates, it has strong ties with Saudi Arabia, and it can pressure a solution that would at least provide a space where the Yemeni state can start operating in one part of the country, and then hoping that with the help of the rest of the Yemeni society, mobilizing and using their resources, trying to, and this is one of the points that I'm very concerned of, is the brain drain that is happening, the build up of the capacity of the Yemeni state over the last 30 to 40 years is now leaving the country. And you need to find some place that that would at least start providing a safe haven for those to go back and resume work from inside the country. And then that would give a good model to encourage other regions and other provinces to actually follow suit and say, actually, there is a different scenario, there is a different solution to this ongoing conflict. The final thing I would say is, again, the Houthis should not be rewarded for pursuing violence. The attempts of what Dr. Nabeel mentioned, the 12 years of conflict with the Houthis, that's true. But let's not forget that during 2011 and 2014, Hadi took the advice that he will not fight the Houthis, that instead he will give them what they actually want. So in a way, they will actually see that it will be best for them to be part of a government instead of actually keep fighting. But what happened was it resulted into the collapse of the state. I cannot see a scenario where you ask any state to actually stay silent while a militia is ongoing, taking more territory, because the coup, although it officially was in September 2014, but effectively it was happening a little like 2 years ahead. Effectively, the state was losing its power in major provinces to the benefit of a militia, to a non-state actor. And that led to chaos. And I'm afraid that that's happening again in Aden, and that's happening again in elsewhere in the country. And no one is pressing the brakes to say, until here, stop. We need to prevent the state from collapsing.
Do you think that the dispute between UAE and Saudi Arabia right now is playing or influencing what's going on the ground in Yemen? Is it playing a major role, or has it caused a shift?
Of course. I mean, I agree with Dr. Nabeel. He mentioned poor leadership. It was primarily the role of Saudi Arabia as the leader, who spearheaded the coalition, to prevent any groups from merging from inside the same coalition that it was leading. But unfortunately, that did not happen, and unfortunately, the Yemeni people are paying the price. Unfortunately, we saw a wave of immigration and IDPs and refugees leaving Sana'a following the takeover of the Houthis. Now we're seeing the same thing in Aden. And that's what's concerning me. People are quickly losing hope of finding any place that they would see a future for them. It is important at a certain time to actually show the people that actually, if not today, tomorrow, they will be able to provide for their families. They will be able to put food on their table. At least tomorrow, there is that hope, even if today is bleak and grim. But that's not happening right now. That's not happening because of all those factors that I've just mentioned and what the respected panelists have mentioned too.
Thank you very much. We have a question here, and it says, did the brief retake of parts of Al-Baghdad prove that pressuring the Houthis militarily is actually possible? Hannah, would you like to answer that question?
Well, I think just the phrasing saying that it's the brief retake of parts of Al-Baghdad answers the question itself. If you can only temporarily seize territory from the Houthis, which then they immediately recover, it's very difficult to argue that they can be defeated or pressured militarily. And we've seen this for years now. The government forces, pro-Hadi forces will say, oh, we've just seized this territory from the Houthis. And maybe they hold on to it for 12 hours or a few weeks, and then the Houthis managed to take it back. And it's just this push-pull with very little progress being made. But on the whole, we have to acknowledge the Houthis control all of northern Yemen with the exception of Ma'rib, and that there is the possibility that they might seize Ma'rib as well. They're incredibly strong militarily, and to Bada's point about, putting military pressure on them to ensure that they might be pushed to negotiations, I like that in theory, and I wish that that was the case, but I just do not see how the past 6.5 years would indicate that that is what is going to happen. I mean, even when the Houthis did join the negotiating table or they adhered to a ceasefire, they simply just regrouped at that point, and it made them stronger. And then they launched attacks that were very successful. So I would be curious to hear from Bada about how he sees a negotiation process happening, assuming that we were able to militarily pressure the Houthis to join the table.
Should I respond to that?
Yeah, go ahead.
The first of all is the answer is in the question, the brief take of Al-Bayda. What happened? So that's again an example of what I say when you talk to people on the ground, reverse to what people. Of course, when someone is viewing it from far, would say, well, that's the same point. They lose and then they gain. They lose and then they gain. But that brief take did give a lot of push. I contacted tribal leaders inside Al-Bayda on that 2 weeks where they at least some of them went back to their homes, and they gained back confidence that actually this is possible. We can go back to our homes. What happened was simply, because of the dispute happening between Saudi Arabia and the UAE, the STC groups, which are loyal to the UAE, prevented the backup forces to enter Al-Bayda. And that negotiations kept on happening for 3 continuous weeks just to convince them to send military backup to the main fronts, at least to secure the fronts that have been gained. But that didn't reach. Eventually, of course, if you have a group with limited supply, they will lose when the Houthis have constant military pressure. And that's what, again, to my point, you need some military pressure. You need some military pressure to push back to the political track. Of course, at the end of the day, no one is saying you will have a total military victory. No one is saying that the Houthis are Yemenis. I mean, they come from the same provinces that I'm from Hajjah, and many of the people I know are considered to be their normal constituents. That's a reality. That's a solution that only it's for the Yemenis to resolve. But for the time being, it doesn't make sense to tell the tribes in Al-Bayda or the people in Taiz, or like you have to, or even the people in Ma'rib, that you have just to hand over your homes and lands and leave. Where would they go to? You have over 2 million refugees inside Ma'rib. Where would they go? It doesn't make sense. And inside Ma'rib, you literally have entire villages and families. Everyone has someone who is decapitated, killed, or injured, and they don't want to see the Houthis take over their land. That's a normal reaction from any group, whether it's in Yemen or any other place, regardless of those semantics. Do they fight for the legitimate government? Do they fight for this and that? That's just a reaction for any local community, I would say.
We have a question that's asking, as you've all mentioned, there's poor leadership on the ground to support the Yemeni voice. How can that state be rebuilt? So, that's not just a Houthi state. That's, a state that may be for everybody.
Let me jump in here a bit. I think all over the Middle East, there is kind of a revolutionary ferment, and that has existed at least since 2011 and the uprisings. In all these states, forces have been unleashed that are not always very pleasant to live with, whether domestically in each country or regionally or internationally, whether they be the Muslim Brotherhood or different Islamist forces that want essentially some kind of a religious government. Unfortunately, this is the reality. This is the geopolitical reality in the region. And in order to stop the killing and begin to reconstruct, you're going to have to live with forces that you don't really like. And your best hope is to try to influence them by working with them. Now, the other thing, and Barat was referring again to the use of force, the problem is first the state has collapsed. So yes, you don't want a state with militias running around, but the fact is there is no state currently in Yemen. And in rebuilding, you have to start with power realities. You have to start with the militia leaders, unfortunately. They cannot just disappear overnight because you wish them to disappear. And therefore, you have to negotiate some kind of a working formula, some kind of a national government. And my assessment with Baya and with other Yemen is that there is currently no power configuration inside the country that can reverse the hold that the Houthis have on the areas that they have. At best, they can check their advance in Ma'rib, or should they take Ma'rib, check their advance into other areas further south. The only thing that can, there was potentially a move by Tariq Saleh from Hodeidah going east towards Ma'rib. But then that fizzled out. And my best guess is that the UAE did not really want him to leave Hodeidah and go join the fight for Ma'rib. And without Tariq Saleh, even with Tariq Saleh, there was no victory guaranteed against the Houthis in Ma'rib. But without him, certainly there is no victory. Only victory against the Houthis can come from outside forces. The US can't do that. The Saudis have already proven to be failures at that. And the UAE does not want to fight inside Yemen. They already have what they really wanted from Yemen. And so at the end of the day, you're stuck with the Houthis being where they are currently. And your best option is to try to stop their advance and work with them, reconstruct the state with them, whether one likes them or not.
Thank you very much, Dr. Khoury. I would like to, is there anyone else who would like to send us final questions? We're only accepting questions in the chat. Sorry, we're not opening up the floor for anybody other than the speakers. Hannah, Bara, Dr. Khoury, were there any last comments you'd like to make today?
My final comments would be there is definitely a challenging reality across the Middle East that the modern national state, the modern nation state, is challenging. But what I would say is definitely the collapse of that modern nation state would be catastrophic, and we could see that happening in places like Iraq. Now, Dr. Khoury is in Lebanon. He can witness that. What's going to happen? I certainly hope and wish the best for the Lebanese people, and I don't wish to see anything happening in Yemen would be emerged again. But there are challenges. The only solution that I would say is people need to fight that. That's not a doomed reality that people will have to live without a modern nation state, without a state, basically. We need, and in Yemen, at least in the places where the Houthis do not control, you need to revive the state apparatus. There is no other solution. We can go back and forth. The United States can influence its allies, especially the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, to join forces to actually revive the state apparatus inside the places that the Houthis do not control. And then engage with the Houthis after that and say, yes, we want you then to be part of a more inclusive process. For now, the Houthis are not interested in that. That's why I again emphasize they need to be stopped and then invited. But if they're not willing to stop, of course, it is the reality of any local community that they will fight back. They're not waiting for someone like me or anyone else to tell them to do that, because that's the challenging reality. And if they keep we're hearing the same message from the international community that they need to hand over their land to the Houthis and leave, they will lose faith in the international community and won't trust any solution coming by the UN or the United States or the international brokers. But we need to revive for them a state apparatus that they can feel that at least there is something coming, at least there is some hope coming. And then when they see that actually there is a safety net, there is some state structure rebuilding, there are services being provided in their provinces, this will encourage and motivate good models to actually follow suit. And even in the provinces that the Houthis control, people will see actually there is a future. The future is not doomed with war, famine, and disease.
Thank you very much, Bara. And it seems that we've covered all of our questions for today. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you for this wonderful discussion. And thanks to everybody who were here with us today. We appreciate you all. Just a reminder, a report will be published summarizing this webinar in Arabic and in English, and it will be emailed to all of our participants. It will also be available on our website, WCYSUS.org. Please make sure to subscribe to our mailing list on our website. Also follow us on Twitter and Facebook. You can find the links in the chat, and you'll receive our monthly updates and stay up to date with future events. Thank you again, Dr. Khoury. Thank you again, Hannah. And thank you again, Mr. Shayban, for joining us today.